right, buckle up, because today we're diving deep into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck.
Yeah.
But before you write this off as just another self-help book, let me tell you, Manson's got a pretty unique take on things.
He definitely does, yeah. It's not your typical think positive kind of deal. He kind of flips the script and says, maybe it's about figuring out what you don't care about. That's where the real freedom is.
So it's not about becoming like a total emotionless robot, right?
Mm.
There's got to be more to it than just saying screw it to everything.
Totally, yeah. It's not about apathy at all. It's more like, look, we all have limited energy, right? We can't get worked up about every single thing. So the trick is like figuring out what really matters to you based on your own values and then kind of letting go of the rest.
Yeah. Picking your battles, right? Choosing where you want to invest that energy. Okay, I'm already starting to see how this could be kind of huge. One of the first things that really jumped out at me in the book was the story of Charles Bukowski. This guy was, well, he was kind of a mess. Drinking, gambling, the whole 9 yards. But he ends up becoming a successful writer. And get this, his tombstone actually says, "Don't try." How crazy is that?
Right. It's so counterintuitive, but that's kind of Manson's point. Like, Bukowski didn't find success by trying to fit into some mold. He just embraced his flaws, wrote honestly about them, and people connected with that, Makes you think, how often are we like trying so hard to be something we're not that we actually block ourselves from success?
Yeah, it's like
Right.
the harder you try to force it, the more you get in your own way. Ever feel that way? Like we're almost creating problems for ourselves by worrying too much. Which kind of brings me to another idea Manson talks about.
Yeah.
This whole feedback loop from hell thing.
Ah, yeah, the feedback loop from hell. That's where you get stuck in this cycle of, like, feeling bad about feeling bad, Like, Manson himself talks about how he'd get anxious about being anxious. We've all been there, right?
Oh, for sure. And it's easy to get sucked into that vortex, especially with all the pressure to, like, always be positive and put on a happy face.
Yeah, and Manson's point is forcing that positivity isn't the answer either. It's more about accepting those negative emotions as like a normal part of the human experience, which actually kind of connects to his whole idea about happiness as a problem-solving process. Oh, and you know what? I loved how he used that disappointment panda to illustrate that.
Oh, that was brilliant. A superhero who tells people harsh truths.
Right? It's such a good analogy. What the disappointment panda highlights is that happiness isn't about avoiding problems altogether. Because let's face it, that's impossible. It's more about like tackling those problems head on, learning from them, and, kind of growing through that whole process.
So it's not about reaching this magical state of perpetual bliss. It's more about building up the resilience to deal with all the ups and downs.
All right.
This reminds me of the story Manson tells about that prince who thought suffering would give him meaning. So he ditches all his riches, embraces poverty, and at the end, he's like, wait a minute, suffering just sucks.
Totally. It really challenges that whole idea that happiness is something you just passively receive. It's not about seeking out suffering. It's about choosing the right struggles, the ones that align with your values, and then finding meaning in overcoming them. And you know what? That's where our values come into play big time. They really shape how we view success and failure. Manson has this great example comparing musicians, Dave Mustaine from Megadeth and Pete Best, the original drummer for the Beatles.
Yeah, so Mustaine, even after achieving success with Megadeth, he was still kind of fixated on Metallica's bigger fame, always comparing and feeling like he came up short. But Best, after the initial sting of getting replaced in the Beatles, he actually found happiness in family and a more low-key life. Same situation, totally different outcomes.
Right. It all boils down to the values and the metrics we're using to measure our lives. Mustaine's metric was always tied to, like, surpassing Metallica, so he was always feeling inadequate. Best, though, he shifted his focus to other values and found fulfillment in different ways. It's crazy how much our chosen metrics can impact our well-being. Oh, and speaking of shifting perspectives, Manson makes a really important distinction between taking responsibility and, just blaming others. He uses his own experience of getting dumped by a girlfriend who cheated on him.
Ouch, yeah. I remember that story. He initially blamed her for his misery, which, I mean, come on, that's pretty understandable. But eventually, he realized holding on to that blame wasn't helping him move on. Taking responsibility for his own happiness, that was the only way forward.
It's such a powerful lesson, and it goes way beyond romantic relationships, too. Even when someone else is at fault, clinging to that blame kind of keeps us stuck in a victim mentality, right? Manson's encouraging us to shift from that, why is this happening to me, to what can I do about it?
Yeah.
Even if we didn't create the problem, we always have the power to choose our response.
So true. And that takes a lot of courage, especially when it's easier to just play the blame game. But Manson also warns against clinging to certainty as a way to, like, avoid discomfort, you know?
Mm-hmm.
He tells a story about a self-help enthusiast he met, Erin, who used absolute certainty as a shield to avoid facing her own issues.
Oh, yeah, the Aaron story. That's a great example of how clinging to certainty can actually prevent us from growing. Being open to being wrong, embracing that uncertainty, that's where real learning and change happen.
Being comfortable with not having all the answers.
Yeah.
I can see that. And sometimes it's about being willing to say no to things that just don't align with your values, even in relationships.
Yeah.
Which, speaking of, I love how Manson uses Romeo and Juliet, the ultimate love story, right? To show how over-the-top romantic love can actually be unhealthy and destructive.
It's such a good example because it challenges those cultural assumptions about, what makes a good relationship. Manson argues that healthy relationships need strong boundaries where, both people take responsibility for their own emotions and they're willing to both reject and be rejected.
So it's counterintuitive, but being able to say no is actually crucial for a strong bond. Manson himself went through a period where he rejected that whole travel the world, experience everything lifestyle to focus on a few key values like writing, his partner, close friends, and just having a single home base.
Yeah, that was a big turning point for him. It's like he realized chasing all that novelty wasn't actually fulfilling. It was the depth of experience, the commitment to a few core values that brought him real happiness. It's almost like saying yes to everything can leave you feeling kind of empty, But consciously choosing what to commit to, that can be super liberating.
Going deep instead of wide, focusing your energy on what really matters. Which kind of leads us to this really profound part of the book where Manson reflects on death. He shares the story of his friend Josh, who tragically died while cliff diving. And this event really had a deep impact on Manson. It forced him to confront his own mortality and the idea that a life spent avoiding discomfort, well, it's ultimately meaningless.
Yeah, it's a heavy reminder that our time is limited, isn't it? Makes you think about what's truly important. What kind of legacy do we want to leave behind? This is where Manson connects with the work of Ernest Becker, that anthropologist who studied how we humans deal with the fear of death.
Oh, right. Becker argued that we create these immortality projects, ways to leave a lasting impact as a way to cope with the anxiety of, knowing we're going to die someday.
Exactly. Think about your own life for a second. What are some of the ways you try to, create a sense of lasting impact? Are those projects actually fulfilling? Or are they driven by, this fear of being insignificant?
Wow. That's a deep question.
Yeah.
Definitely something to think about. It seems like Manson, like Becker, is suggesting that accepting our mortality can actually be freeing. Like it lets us choose our values without the burden of needing to achieve some grand, lasting legacy.
It's about finding meaning and purpose in the here and now, in the everyday moments, rather than chasing some abstract idea of immortality.
So it's not about getting caught up in what if or what will people remember me for. It's more about living a life that feels authentic and meaningful to you right here, right now.
Exactly. And that's really the heart of Manson's philosophy. It's not about achieving some external measure of success or happiness. It's about choosing your values and then living in a way that reflects those values.
Embracing the messy, imperfect journey and finding fulfillment in the process, not just the outcome.
You got it. And that journey, well, that's what we're going to keep exploring in the next part of our deep dive. We'll get into Manson's insights on how to figure out what truly matters to you, how to overcome fear and uncertainty, and ultimately, how to create a life you could be proud of.
Stay tuned, because we're just getting started. Welcome back to our deep dive into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck. So we've been talking about his ideas on happiness, values, and taking responsibility for our lives, choosing our struggles, embracing uncertainty, all that good stuff. But now you might be thinking, okay, how do I actually do all this? It's one thing to understand the concepts, but how do I actually apply them to my real life? Like, where do I even start?
It's true, yeah. It's like having all the ingredients for an amazing meal, but no recipe, right? We need that guidance to turn these ideas into action. Luckily, Manson does give us some practical advice on how to navigate life and make choices that, really line up with our values.
Okay, cool. So what's the recipe? Where do we start?
Well, he talks about something he calls the failure-success paradox. It might sound a little weird at first, but bear with me. He uses this great example of Pablo Picasso. Even in his later years, Picasso was still creating art, like effortlessly, just doodling on napkins as if it were nothing. And guess what? Those napkins were worth a fortune.
It's kind of mind-blowing. Something so simple could be so valuable. But it seems like the takeaway here is that Picasso wasn't focused on the fame or the money. His metric for success was just the joy of creating, right? He was committed to what Manson calls honest expression.
Exactly. And that focus on the process, rather than just the outcome, allowed him to stay so productive throughout his life. There's a huge lesson there for all of us, you know? How often do we get bogged down by focusing on the end goal at the happily ever after, and we totally forget to enjoy the journey itself?
It's so true. We're always chasing the destination, and we miss out on all the experiences, all the growth that happens along the way. But Manson's arguing that it's actually in those stumbles, in those failures, where we truly learn and evolve.
He makes a really interesting point about pain being a crucial part of that process. He actually studied World War II survivors and found that the ones who went through the most hardship often developed this incredible resilience and a deeper appreciation for life. Sounds crazy, right? But their struggles actually made their lives better.
So it's not about like actively seeking out pain,
Yeah.
but understanding that it's just an inevitable part of growth, right?
Yeah.
Does that mean we need to go out of our way to put ourselves in difficult situations to get stronger?
Not necessarily, no. It's more about changing how we think about pain. Instead of being afraid of it and avoiding it all the time, we can learn to accept it as a natural part of life. And actually, it's an opportunity for growth. It's kind of like physical exercise. You have to challenge your muscles to make them stronger, right? Same thing with our emotional resilience.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. It's not about seeking out pain, but like changing your perspective when it does show up. Instead of asking, why is this happening to me? We can ask, what can I learn from this?
Exactly. That shift in perspective is so important. Once we accept that pain is unavoidable, that it's actually necessary for growth, then we can start asking ourselves better questions. Questions like, what pain am I willing to put up with? Or what struggles do I choose to take on?
Those are powerful questions because they take us out of that victim mentality and give us back a sense of, agency and control. It makes me think about how much time I've wasted trying to avoid any discomfort. And in the end, it was really holding me back from experiencing life fully.
Yeah, it's a common struggle for sure. But Manson says action is the key to breaking out of that cycle. He even suggests kind of reversing the typical motivation formula. Instead of waiting for inspiration to hit before you do anything, he says, just take action first. Even if it's a tiny step, let that action fuel your motivation.
It's like that saying, motion creates emotion. We tend to wait for motivation to magically appear. But maybe it works the other way around. Maybe it's the act of doing something that sparks that motivation within us.
Exactly. Think about it. Have you ever noticed how once you actually start working on something, even if you weren't feeling it at first, you suddenly start to feel more into it, more motivated? That same principle applies to so many areas of life, whether it's starting a new relationship or a project, or even just, getting off the couch and going for a walk.
Sometimes we just need to take that first step, that leap of faith, and trust that the motivation will catch up. And you know what? Speaking of leaps of faith, Manson also talks about commitment. Specifically, like rejecting that life of endless options and distractions, and instead finding depth and meaning. He shares his own story about giving up a life of constant travel to focus on writing, his partner, and his close friends.
Yeah, that was a big turning point for him. He realized that constantly chasing new experiences wasn't actually fulfilling. It was through really committing to and investing in a few key areas of his life that he found real happiness and purpose.
It makes you wonder if that constant pursuit of more experiences, more possessions, more options, if it's actually leading us away from what really matters.
It's a good question to ask ourselves for sure. I mean, we live in a culture that's all about the hustle and chasing the next big thing. But Manson's arguing that there's this real freedom that comes from choosing to focus on what truly matters and letting go of the rest.
Recognizing that our time and energy are limited and making conscious choices about how we spend them, right? And as Manson points out, sometimes it's the things we choose not to do that have the biggest impact. Which brings us back to that idea of strategically not giving a feck.
Right. It's about saying no to distractions, to things that don't align with our values, and then focusing our energy on what actually matters. It sounds simple enough, but it can be really hard to actually do. We're constantly bombarded with messages telling us to do more, be more, achieve more. It's easy to lose sight of what's important with all that noise.
So how do we stay focused in all that chaos? How do we avoid getting lost in all the shoulds and expectations?
Well, Manson has this really powerful tool for navigating all of that, and it might sound kind of dark, but it's confronting the reality of our own mortality. He argues that accepting the fact that life is finite can actually be super liberating.
And retells that story about his friend Josh, who tragically died while cliff diving. That event really had a profound impact on Manson. It forced him to face his own mortality and reevaluate his priorities.
It was a real wake-up call for him, yeah. It made him realize that we don't have unlimited time to waste on things that don't matter. It inspired him to embrace discomfort, take risks, and go after his passions with more urgency.
It's a powerful reminder that life is precious, that we shouldn't take it for granted.
Exactly. And this kind of leads us to a key concept from the work of Ernest Becker, remember? That anthropologist who studied how humans deal with the fear of death. He argued that we create these immortality projects, ways to leave a lasting impact on the world, as a way to deal with that anxiety of knowing we're all going to die someday.
Right, right. It's like we're trying to create something that'll outlive us,
Yeah.
A way to transcend our own mortality.
Exactly. And while these projects can be positive, they can also become a source of neurosis and unhealthy attachment if we're not careful. Manson, building on Becker's ideas, suggests that accepting our mortality can actually free us from that trap. It allows us to choose our values more freely, without the need to achieve some grand, lasting legacy.
So it's about finding meaning and purpose in the present moment, in the everyday stuff, rather than striving for some abstract idea of immortality.
That's it, yeah. It's about recognizing that true greatness doesn't come from external achievements or accolades. It comes from choosing your values and living in line with them.
He even suggests that we're all already great, just by existing, by going through life's ups and downs, and making choices about what matters to us. That's pretty powerful.
It is powerful. It's a reminder that you don't need to wait for some kind of external validation or achievement to feel worthy or fulfilled. The power to create a meaningful life is already inside each of us.
It's about embracing our imperfections, choosing our struggles, and living with intention. But there's one question I'm still kind of wrestling with. How do we deal with those inevitable setbacks and failures that come with, trying to live a life of purpose?
That's a great question, and it's one we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll dig into Manson's insights on how to learn from those failures, how to build resilience when things get tough, and ultimately how to develop a mindset that allows us to thrive no matter what life throws our way.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck.
Yeah.
We've talked about a lot, choosing our struggles, accepting that we're all going to die someday, getting comfortable not knowing everything. But now I think it's time to tackle something that most people really try to avoid talking about: failure.
Yeah, you're right. Failure is definitely something we usually try to avoid, like the plague. But Manson doesn't shy away from it. He jumps right in and says, look, it's going to happen. It's just part of life, especially if we're, pushing ourselves outside our comfort zones and trying to do things that really matter to us.
He even shares his own story, like when he was first trying to find a job during the Great Recession, getting rejected left and right, feeling like a total failure right out of the gate. But he also talks about how that experience, as tough as it was, actually gave him the courage to go his own way and become an entrepreneur.
It's a great example of how failure, even though it's painful, can be the thing that pushes us towards something better. You know that saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Well, Manson takes it a step further and says, maybe we shouldn't just endure failure. Maybe we should embrace it, see it as a chance to learn and grow. He even calls it the way forward, which I thought was interesting.
That's a pretty different way of looking at things, especially in our culture where failure is often seen as this embarrassing thing that makes you less worthy. But how do we actually go from being afraid of failing to actually embracing it? Where do we even start with that?
Well, Manson breaks it down into some practical steps. First, he says, you got to realize that our brains are basically wired to avoid failure. It's like a built-in survival mechanism. But he also reminds us that our brains aren't always right. Think about it. How many times have you totally freaked out about something, imagined the worst possible scenario, and then in the end, everything turned out okay?
Oh, all the time. It's like our minds are programmed to focus on the negative.
Exactly. So that's why it's important to develop a healthy skepticism of our own thoughts and feelings. We got to question our assumptions, Be open to other ways of looking at things. Things like mindfulness and self-reflection can be really helpful with that. They give you a chance to just observe your thoughts without judgment and start to challenge the ones that aren't helping you.
Manson also talks about separating our emotions from reality. He uses his own struggles with social anxiety as an example. He used to feel like everyone was constantly judging him, even though in reality there was no proof of that. It was just his anxiety talking.
I think we've all been there at some point.
Yeah.
It's easy to fall into that trap of letting our emotions, color how we see things instead of just seeing things as they are. Manson says that once we recognize this tendency, we can start to detach from those negative thoughts and feelings and make decisions from a more, rational place.
So it's about being more self-aware,
Mm.
right? Noticing those thought patterns and emotional reactions, and then challenging the ones that are holding us back.
Exactly. And once we can see our thoughts and feelings more objectively, then we can start to experiment with different behaviors, even if they feel a little uncomfortable at first. And this is where Manson's idea of action, inspiration, motivation comes in.
Right. Instead of waiting for inspiration to hit us before we do anything, we can just take that first step, even if it's tiny, and trust that the motivation will show up eventually. Like we've been talking about this whole time. Motion creates emotion. And that applies not only to overcoming fear, but also to learning from those times when we do fail.
Totally. Manson wants us to see failure not as like a sign of defeat, but as valuable feedback. He says we should ask ourselves questions like, what did I learn from this? Or how can I use this experience to do better next time?
So instead of beating yourself up with, I'm a failure, it's more like, okay, this didn't work out the way I planned. What can I change for next time?
Yeah, exactly. And that ties in with the idea of developing a growth mindset, which Manson talks about a lot. It's basically the belief that our abilities and our intelligence aren't set in stone. They can be developed through practice and learning. A growth mindset lets us see challenges as opportunities to get better instead of, threats to our ego. And that's so important for success in any area of life.
So it's not about becoming some kind of superhuman who never fails. It's more about building up that resilience, that ability to bounce back, learn from mistakes, and just keep moving forward.
Exactly. It's about accepting that life is messy and imperfect, and knowing that failure isn't the opposite of success. It's actually part of it.
This has been such a fascinating look into Mark Manson's work. He really challenges us to rethink our ideas about happiness, success, and what it means to live a good life.
He definitely does. He encourages us to choose our values carefully, embrace the unknown, and find meaning in the everyday stuff, even when things are hard. And you know what? He reminds us that even though we all face failure and eventually death, we still have the power to create a legacy that matters.
So next time you're feeling overwhelmed or stuck, remember Manson's advice. Choose your struggles, question your assumptions, and don't be afraid to fail.
And who knows? Maybe by not giving a feck about the things that don't really matter, you'll discover the things that truly do. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned some valuable insights that'll help you navigate life's twists and turns and build a life you're truly proud of.